Behind the leather pants and mystical lyrics of the Doors lay a treasure trove of bizarre secrets that would make even the most devoted fans do a double take. From using a lead-poisoned carnival instrument on their debut album to Jim Morrison's father commanding the naval forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the band's story is filled with jaw-dropping coincidences, studio madness, and incidents so strange they sound like rock and roll fiction. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about the Doors. Fact 1. They used a poisonous carnival instrument. When the Doors recorded their cover of Alabama Song for their 1967 debut album, they needed something special to capture the old world, carnival atmosphere of the original Kurt Weill composition. Producer Paul Rothchild had the perfect solution, though it came with a deadly twist that nobody realized at the time. He brought in a bizarre instrument called a marxophone, a contraption that looked like it belonged in a traveling circus rather than a professional recording studio. The marxophone was invented in 1912 by Henry Charles Marx as a combination zither and keyboard instrument designed for amateur musicians who couldn't read traditional sheet music. The device featured spring-loaded hammers made of white lead that would bounce against metal strings when you pressed down on metal strips, creating a distinctive jingle-jangly sound that resembled a cross between a mandolin and a music box. These instruments were sold door-to-door by traveling salesmen and through mail-order catalogs like Sears, marketed as easy-to-play entertainment for the whole family. Ray Manzarek had never encountered anything like it before. When Rothschild suggested using the marxophone, Manzarek admitted he had no idea what the producer was talking about. Rothschild explained it was a hammer zither, drawing on his folk music background from New York City, where such unusual instruments were better known. The moment they tried it out, everyone knew they had found the perfect sound for their haunting interpretation of the German cabaret song. You can hear the marxophone's otherworldly contribution throughout Alabama Song, especially during the Moon of Alabama section, where it moves to the front of the mix. The instrument creates those mysteriously long-ringing notes that sound almost like a piano but with an eerie mechanical quality that perfectly matches the song's dark carnival atmosphere. What makes this story particularly unsettling is that the lead hammers literally shed toxic powder every time the instrument is played. Modern musicians who use vintage marxophones have learned to coat the hammers in epoxy glue to prevent lead poisoning. But back in 1967, nobody understood the health risks. The Doors unknowingly exposed themselves to a toxic heavy metal while creating one of their most atmospheric recordings. Fact 2. Jim's dad started the Vietnam War. One of the most shocking ironies in rock history involves Jim Morrison's family background and how it connected to the very war his generation would spend years protesting against. Morrison's father, Rear Admiral George Stephen Morrison, wasn't just any military officer. He was the naval commander who played a crucial role in escalating American involvement in Vietnam through his actions during the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. Admiral Morrison was aboard the USS Bonhomme Richard aircraft carrier, commanding the entire carrier division during those fateful days when North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. This incident provided the justification that President Lyndon Johnson needed to dramatically increase American military presence in Southeast Asia, effectively launching the full-scale Vietnam War that would define the next decade. Many historians have since questioned whether the attacks actually happened as reported, but at the time, Admiral Morrison's official reports helped convince Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The elder Morrison had witnessed major historical events throughout his military career, including the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, and had become a familiar figure around the Pentagon and Cape Canaveral. He was the epitome of the military establishment that his son would later rebel against so dramatically. When Admiral Morrison learned about Jim's desire to become a rock singer, he wrote a stern letter urging his son to give up any idea of singing or any connection with a music group because of what I consider to be a complete lack of talent in this direction. This family conflict created a permanent rift between father and son. Jim Morrison effectively cut off all contact with his father after receiving that letter, and the two never saw each other again. The admiral later admitted privately in 1970 that his son's reluctance to communicate with me again is, to me, quite understandable. Meanwhile, Jim Morrison had become one of the leading voices of the counterculture movement, writing songs that questioned authority and protested the very war his father had helped start, creating one of the strangest family dynamics in rock and roll history. Fact 3. They watched themselves on TV, mid-concert. During one of the most surreal moments in concert history, the Doors literally stopped their live performance to watch themselves on television, creating a bizarre situation where the audience found themselves watching the band watch themselves on screen. This strange incident happened on December 28, 1967. During the second of 3 shows at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco, when the Doors had pre-recorded performances for the Jonathan Winters show that were scheduled to air that same evening, the band was halfway through their electrifying version of Backdoor Man when they suddenly realized their television appearance was about to start. Without any warning to the confused audience, all 4 members simply stopped playing in the middle of the song and walked over to the side of the stage where crew members had wheeled out a television set. The entire band then stood there and watched themselves perform Light My Fire and Moonlight Drive on the small screen, completely abandoning their live audience who were left staring at an empty stage. Ray Manzarek later recalled this moment with obvious amusement, explaining that they had the audience watching them while they watched themselves performing on television, creating this weird loop of performance and observation. The crowd, initially bewildered by what was happening, seemed to go along with the absurdity of the situation, perhaps recognizing that they were witnessing something completely unprecedented in rock and roll. After their television performance finished, Manzarek simply walked back over to the TV, switched it off with a casual gesture, returned to his keyboard, and counted the band back into Backdoor Man exactly where they had left off. The song resumed as if nothing unusual had happened, though the audience had just experienced one of the most bizarre interruptions in concert history. This incident perfectly captured the Doors' willingness to break conventional rules about live performance and their comfort with creating unexpected, almost theatrical moments that challenged what audiences expected from a rock concert. The fact that they could stop mid-song, watch themselves on television, and then seamlessly continue performing demonstrates the band's confidence and their unique approach to entertainment that often blurred the lines between music, theater, and pure spontaneous weirdness. Fact 4. Morrison took band asthma medicine. Jim Morrison carried a potentially deadly secret in his pocket throughout his career with the Doors, using a prescription inhaler that contained a drug combination so dangerous it was eventually banned by the United States government. Morrison suffered from asthma and relied on a medication called Merix, which he took through an inhaler to help him breathe during performances and daily life. But this seemingly innocent medical treatment created a ticking time bomb when combined with his notorious drinking habits. Merix was a popular asthma medication during the 1960s that combined 3 different drugs to help open airways and reduce breathing difficulties. The medication worked effectively for treating asthma symptoms, which is why doctors regularly prescribed it to patients like Morrison who needed reliable relief from their breathing problems. However, medical researchers later discovered that the specific combination of chemicals in Merix created severe and potentially fatal interactions when mixed with alcohol, leading to dangerous effects on the heart and nervous system. The timing of this discovery makes Morrison's story even more unsettling because he was unknowingly putting himself at extreme risk every time he drank alcohol while using his prescribed medication. Morrison was already well known for his heavy drinking, often consuming large amounts of alcohol before and during performances, at recording sessions, and throughout his daily life. Every drink he took, while using his Merix inhaler, was essentially a gamble with his health. though neither he nor his doctors understood the danger at the time. The United States eventually banned Marex specifically because medical authorities determined that the risk of death from combining it with alcohol was too high to justify its continued use. This ban came after Morrison's death in 1971, but it raises serious questions about whether his regular use of this dangerous medication combination might have contributed to his health problems and early death. Friends and colleagues who knew Morrison during his Doors years have since revealed that he used his inhaler regularly, often pulling it out during rehearsals, recording sessions, and backstage before concerts. The fact that he was essentially taking a medication that could kill him when mixed with his favorite substance adds another layer of tragedy to his already complicated relationship with alcohol and prescription drugs. Fact 5. They met through transcendental meditation. The Doors might never have existed if Ray Manzarek hadn't decided to attend a transcendental meditation lecture in Los Angeles during the mid-1960s, because that's where he first encountered the two other musicians who would complete the legendary lineup. After Ray had already teamed up with Jim Morrison following their famous beach meeting, he still needed to find a guitarist and drummer to turn their musical partnership into a full band, and he discovered both of them sitting in the same room learning about meditation techniques. Transcendental meditation was becoming increasingly popular in California during this period, attracting young people who were interested in exploring Eastern spirituality and alternative ways of thinking about consciousness and personal development. The practice involved learning specific meditation techniques that were supposed to help practitioners achieve deeper states of relaxation and awareness, and many musicians and artists were drawn to these ideas as a way to expand their creative potential and find new sources of inspiration. At one of these meditation lectures, Manzarek met both Robbie Krieger, a young guitarist with a background in flamenco and classical music, and John Densmore, a jazz-influenced drummer who was already exploring different approaches to rhythm and percussion. The three musicians discovered they shared not only an interest in meditation, but also similar ideas about music and what they wanted to achieve as artists. This common ground in both spirituality and musical ambition created an immediate connection that would prove essential to the band's future success. John Densmore later reflected on how important this spiritual connection was to the formation of the Doors, making the memorable statement that there wouldn't be any Doors without Maharishi. He was referring to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the Indian spiritual teacher who had developed and popularized the transcendental meditation technique that brought the three musicians together in the first place. Densmore's comment highlights how the band's shared interest in meditation and Eastern philosophy wasn't just a casual hobby, but actually formed part of the foundation of their musical partnership. Interestingly, Jim Morrison was initially reluctant to join his bandmates in their meditation practice, but he eventually became convinced to attend some sessions after the others encouraged him to explore these techniques for expanding consciousness and creativity. Fact 6. Morrison threatened to smash Buicks on stage. One of the most explosive conflicts within the Doors happened when Jim Morrison discovered that his bandmates had secretly licensed their biggest hit song for a car commercial while he was out of the country, leading to threats of vehicular destruction that would have made rock and roll history. The trouble began after the Doors finished their 1968 European tour in Sweden on September 20th. When Morrison decided to stay in London with his girlfriend Pamela Corson to work on his poetry, leaving his bandmates completely in the dark about his plans and whereabouts. While Morrison was away focusing on his writing under the guidance of poet Michael McClure, representatives from Buick contacted the Doors with an offer that seemed too good to refuse. The car company wanted to license "Light My Fire" for a major advertising campaign, and was willing to pay $75,000 for the rights, which was an enormous sum of money in 1968. The commercial would feature the memorable slogan, "Come on Buick, light my fire," playing off the song's famous lyrics in a way that Buick's marketing team thought would be clever and appealing to younger car buyers. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore saw this as an interesting business opportunity and agreed to the deal without consulting Morrison, since they had no way to reach him and assumed he would approve of such a lucrative arrangement. However, when Morrison finally found out about the Buick commercial, he was absolutely furious about what he saw as a complete betrayal of the band's artistic integrity and his personal values as a poet and performer. Morrison's reaction was swift and characteristically dramatic. He immediately contacted the band's management and declared that if the Buick deal wasn't canceled immediately, he would make sure to smash a Buick automobile during every single Doors concert for the rest of their career. This wasn't just an empty threat. Morrison was entirely serious about turning their live performances into anti-corporate demonstrations that would destroy Buick vehicles in front of thousands of fans at every show. Band manager Bill Siddons later described this incident as the end of the dream and the end of that era of Jim's relationship with the other members of the band, explaining that from that point forward, their partnership became purely business rather than the close artistic collaboration it had been before. Fact 7. Strange Days used backwards recordings. The Doors pushed the boundaries of studio experimentation during the recording of their 1967 album Strange Days by incorporating cutting-edge techniques that were practically unheard of in rock music at the time, including playing instruments backwards and manually manipulating tape machines to create otherworldly sound effects. The band had access to one of the first 8-track recording machines available in Los Angeles, and they used this advanced technology to explore what producer Paul Rothchild called new techniques of recording with no holds barred. One of the most innovative experiments happened during the recording of Unhappy Girl, where Ray Manzarek deliberately played his keyboard introduction in reverse to create an eerie, supernatural effect that would be impossible to achieve through normal performance. The process involved Manzarek learning to play his part backwards, which required him to think about the melody and timing in a completely different way than he normally would. After recording this reversed keyboard performance, the band then added corresponding overdubs that were designed to work with the backwards music, creating layers of sound that seemed to flow in multiple directions at once. Engineer Bruce Botnick took these experimental techniques even further during the creation of Horse Latitudes, one of the album's most atmospheric and haunting tracks. To create the sound of howling wind that accompanies Jim Morrison's spoken word performance about sailors throwing horses overboard during ocean voyages, Botnick used the white noise generated by a tape recorder and then manually varied the speed by hand-winding the tape machine. This painstaking process involved physically turning the tape reels by hand to create fluctuating pitch and rhythm changes that mimicked the sound of wind blowing across the ocean. The band members also contributed to the experimental atmosphere of Horse Latitudes by playing their regular instruments in completely unconventional ways, abandoning traditional techniques to create strange percussive sounds and atmospheric textures that supported Morrison's dark poetry. These recording sessions represented some of the earliest examples of what would later be called musique concrète techniques being used in popular rock music, where everyday sounds and unconventional recording methods were used to create artistic effects that couldn't be achieved through normal musical performance alone. Fact 8. Morrison never finished his student film. Jim Morrison enrolled at UCLA's prestigious film school with serious ambitions of becoming a filmmaker. But despite his obvious talent and creative vision, he never managed to complete his required student film project, leaving behind an unfinished piece that perfectly captured the rebellious streak that would later define his rock and roll career. Morrison had transferred to UCLA in 1964 specifically to study cinematography after spending time at Florida State University, and he threw himself into learning about film theory, editing techniques, and the artistic possibilities of moving pictures. Terry McCartney Filgate, a respected Canadian filmmaker who taught Morrison during his time at UCLA, recognized that his student possessed genuine artistic ability and a unique perspective that could have led to success in the film industry. However, McCartney-Filgate also observed that Morrison struggled with the discipline and structured approach that filmmaking required, describing him as talented but undisciplined in his approach to completing projects and meeting deadlines. This assessment becomes particularly ironic when you consider Morrison's family background and the strict military environment he grew up in, as the son of a career Navy officer who would eventually become a rear admiral. His father, George Morrison, had built his entire career on discipline, order, and following through on commitments, rising through the ranks of the military through his ability to complete missions and maintain strict standards of conduct. The contrast between the father's military precision and the son's artistic rebellion couldn't have been more dramatic. Morrison's unfinished student film represented more than just an incomplete school assignment. It became a symbol of his rejection of traditional structures and expectations that others tried to impose on him. While his classmates dutifully completed their projects and followed the curriculum as designed, Morrison seemed more interested in exploring the theoretical and philosophical aspects of filmmaking, rather than grinding through the technical requirements needed to produce a finished piece. Colin Young, who served as director of UCLA's film program during Morrison's time there, later commented that Morrison was so naturally gifted that he could have gone directly into professional film directing if he had chosen to focus on that path instead of pursuing music. This assessment makes his failure to complete even a basic student film project all the more puzzling and indicative of his complex personality. Fact 9. They were fired for Oedipal lyrics. The Doors' career-defining moment came when they were abruptly fired from their regular gig at the Whiskey A Go-Go on the Sunset Strip after Jim Morrison shocked the audience and club management with an improvised performance that crossed every line of acceptable entertainment in 1966. The band had been working as the house band at this legendary Los Angeles club, playing multiple sets per night and building a devoted following among the hip crowds that frequented the venue. But Morrison's artistic ambitions and psychological explorations would soon put an end to their steady employment. During what would become their final performance at the Whiskey A Go-Go, Morrison decided to debut the full, uncensored version of The End, a song that had started as a simple goodbye ballad to an ex-girlfriend, but had evolved into something much darker and more complex. As the 11-minute epic built to its climax, Morrison launched into what would become the song's most notorious section, where he portrayed a fictional character walking through a house and encountering family members in increasingly disturbing scenarios. The section that got them fired featured Morrison delivering lines about wanting to kill his father and engage in intimate relations with his mother, drawing directly from the ancient Greek tragedy of Oedipus Rex, but presenting these themes in raw, explicit language that was completely unprecedented in popular music. Morrison performed these shocking lyrics as a dramatic spoken word piece while the band created a swirling, hypnotic musical backdrop that added to the psychological intensity of the performance. The club's management was horrified by what they witnessed, recognizing that Morrison's performance had crossed into territory that could bring serious trouble from authorities and upset the venue's regular customers. The Whiskey A Go-Go immediately terminated the Doors' contract and banned them from ever performing there again, effectively ending their steady income and forcing them to find new ways to build their audience. However, this firing turned out to be one of the best things that could have happened to the band's career, because it established their reputation as dangerous, unpredictable performers who were willing to push boundaries that other musicians wouldn't dare approach. Word of the scandalous performance spread quickly through the Los Angeles music scene, creating curiosity and excitement about what the Doors might do next, and helping them attract the attention of record executives who were looking for artists with genuine shock value. Fact 10. Morrison swallowed hash and missed a show. One of the most embarrassing moments in the Doors' touring history happened during their 1968 European tour, when Jim Morrison completely missed his own band's performance in Amsterdam after making a serious miscalculation about how to consume hashish, leaving thousands of fans staring at an empty stage where their lead singer was supposed to be. The incident occurred when the Doors were sharing the bill with other major American rock acts, including Canned Heat and Jefferson Airplane, as part of a multi-band concert that was supposed to showcase the best of the emerging psychedelic music scene. Before the Doors were scheduled to take the stage, Morrison encountered Bob Haidt, the lead singer of Canned Heat, who was known for his extensive knowledge of different drugs and his willingness to share them with fellow musicians. Haidt offered Morrison what appeared to be a small chunk of hashish, which is typically smoked in very small amounts to achieve the desired effects. However, Morrison was apparently unfamiliar with the proper way to consume this particular substance and made the crucial mistake of swallowing the entire piece instead of smoking it. This error in consumption method meant that Morrison ingested a massive dose of concentrated hashish all at once, which created effects far beyond what he had expected or experienced before. Within a short time, the drug overwhelmed his system and caused him to lose consciousness completely, rendering him unable to perform or even stay awake during his band's scheduled set time. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore found themselves in the impossible position of having to explain to a packed concert hall that their lead singer was unconscious and couldn't perform. The situation became even more bizarre when Morrison finally regained consciousness. But unfortunately, this didn't happen until Jefferson Airplane had already taken the stage for their own set. Still heavily under the influence of the hashish and apparently confused about where he was and what was happening, Morrison stumbled onto the stage during Jefferson Airplane's performance and began trying to participate in their show instead of his own. This incident highlighted Morrison's inexperience with certain drugs and his tendency to act impulsively without considering the consequences, especially when it came to substances he wasn't familiar with. The Amsterdam concert became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the rock music community about the importance of understanding what you're taking and how much is appropriate. Fact 11. Producer used vocoded Morrison's voice. The Doors created one of the first examples of electronic voice processing in rock music during the recording of their title track, Strange Days, when engineer Bruce Botnick developed an innovative technique that allowed Jim Morrison to manipulate his own recorded vocals using a Moog synthesizer keyboard in real time. This groundbreaking experiment happened during the 1967 recording sessions when the Doors had access to cutting-edge studio technology that most musicians had never seen before, including one of the earliest Moog synthesizers available for commercial recording. Botnick came up with the idea of feeding Morrison's already recorded vocal track directly into the Moog synthesizer, essentially turning the electronic instrument into a voice processor that could transform human speech and singing in ways that had never been attempted in popular music. The process involved creating what Botnick called an envelope that allowed Morrison's voice to be filtered through the synthesizer's electronic circuits, where it could be shaped and modified by playing different notes on the keyboard. The technical setup was remarkably sophisticated for its time, requiring Morrison to sit at the Moog keyboard and play specific notes that would process his own voice in real time while listening to the original vocal recording. When Morrison pressed a key on the synthesizer, it would alter the pitch, tone, and character of his voice according to the note he played, creating an otherworldly effect that made his vocals sound like they were coming from underwater or through some kind of electronic filter. Botnick enhanced this effect even further by adding a slight delay to the processed vocals and then feeding the entire signal into what he described as an infinite tape repeat, which created layers of echoing, electronically modified vocals that seemed to float around the original recording. This technique required precise timing and coordination between Morrison's keyboard playing and the playback of his original vocal performance. The result was the haunting, underwater vocal quality that gives Strange Days its distinctive atmosphere and mysterious character. Morrison's voice seems to shimmer and bend throughout the song, creating an effect that perfectly matched the psychedelic and experimental nature of the album. This innovative use of the Moog synthesizer as a vocal processor predated many of the electronic music techniques that would become common decades later, making the Doors pioneers in the field of electronic voice manipulation. Fact 12. Morrison's grave bust was stolen. Jim Morrison's final resting place at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris has been the target of repeated theft and vandalism over the decades, with the most brazen incident occurring in 1988, when someone managed to steal an entire bronze bust of the rock legend that had been placed on his grave site. Morrison was buried in this famous Parisian cemetery in July 1971, after his unexpected death at age 27, and his grave quickly became one of the most visited sites in a cemetery that's already famous for housing the remains of numerous celebrities and historical figures. The original grave marker was relatively simple, but over the years, fans and admirers added various tributes and decorations to honor Morrison's memory, including the bronze bust that captured his distinctive features and long hair in a classical sculptural style. This bust became an iconic part of the gravesite and was frequently photographed by the thousands of visitors who made pilgrimages to pay their respects to the Doors frontman, making its theft particularly shocking to both cemetery officials and Morrison's devoted fans around the world. The theft of the bust wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the most dramatic example of ongoing problems with souvenir hunters and vandals who seemed determined to take pieces of Morrison's grave with them as mementos. Over the years, fans had systematically chipped away small pieces of the original stone headstone, gradually damaging the monument as people broke off fragments to keep as personal relics of their visit to Morrison's final resting place. The vandalism and theft became so problematic that Morrison's parents eventually requested that the graffiti be removed from surrounding graves, where fans had written messages and song lyrics on nearby tombstones belonging to other people buried in the cemetery. The constant stream of visitors and the damage they caused created ongoing tensions between the cemetery administration and the Morrison family, who wanted to preserve the dignity of the burial site while still allowing fans to visit and pay their respects. Eventually, cemetery officials were forced to install a steel fence around Morrison's grave to prevent further vandalism and theft, and the headstone itself has been changed since the original installation. The stolen bust was never recovered, and its whereabouts remain unknown, making it one of the more unusual pieces of missing rock and roll memorabilia in music history. Fact 12. They had no bass player live. The Doors achieved their distinctive sound through one of the most unusual instrumental arrangements in rock history, performing as a quartet without ever using a traditional bass guitarist during their live concerts, instead relying on Ray Manzarek's remarkable ability to play both bass lines and keyboard melodies simultaneously using two different instruments. This unconventional setup came about partly by necessity and partly by choice, as the band discovered that Manzarek's keyboard-bass technique created a sound that was completely different from what other rock bands were producing during the 1960s. Manzarek accomplished this musical feat by using a Fender Rhodes piano bass, a specialized keyboard instrument designed specifically for playing bass lines, which he operated with his left hand while simultaneously playing organ melodies with his right hand on his primary instrument, usually a Vox Continental or Gibson G101 organ. This required extraordinary coordination and musical skill, as Manzarek had to maintain two completely separate musical parts that needed to work together rhythmically and harmonically, while also supporting Jim Morrison's vocals and the performances of guitarist Robbie Krieger and drummer John Densmore. The band initially tried auditioning traditional bass players when they first started performing together, but they quickly discovered that adding a fifth member changed their sound in ways they didn't like. Manzarek later explained that when they auditioned bass players, they ended up sounding like other established rock bands, particularly the Rolling Stones, rather than developing their own unique musical identity. The keyboard-bass approach allowed them to create a sound that was more atmospheric and psychedelic than the typical bass guitar, with sustained tones and unusual textures that a traditional bass couldn't provide. This instrumental arrangement became such a defining characteristic of the Doors' live performances that audiences came to expect and appreciate the unusual setup, with many fans specifically watching Manzarek's incredible two-handed technique during concerts. The absence of a bass player also meant that the band's stage presence was more focused and intimate, with just 4 members creating a wall of sound that seemed much larger than their actual numbers would suggest. However, when the Doors recorded in the studio, they often brought in session musicians to play bass guitar on their albums, as Manzarek explained that his keyboard bass was perfect for live situations, but lacked the articulation needed for professional recordings, where the bass lines needed to cut through the mix more clearly. Fact 14. Morrison called Hitler his lover. During one of his most bizarre and unpredictable stage outbursts, Jim Morrison shocked an audience by making the completely random and nonsensical declaration that Adolf Hitler is alive. "I slept with her last night," demonstrating the kind of erratic behavior that made concert promoters increasingly nervous about booking the Doors for live performances. This strange proclamation was part of Morrison's pattern of saying outrageous things during concerts, often without any apparent connection to the music or any logical reason for bringing up such inflammatory topics. Morrison's tendency to make shocking statements during live performances became one of his most notorious characteristics, as he seemed to enjoy testing the limits of what audiences would tolerate and how far he could push the boundaries of acceptable entertainment. These outbursts often occurred when Morrison was under the influence of alcohol or other substances, which loosened his already minimal inhibitions and led him to say things that were designed to provoke, confuse, or upset the people watching him perform. The Hitler comment was particularly strange because it combined multiple shocking elements in a single sentence, including referencing one of history's most reviled figures, claiming that this person was still alive decades after World War II had ended, and then adding a sexual component by suggesting intimate relations had occurred. The fact that Morrison referred to Hitler as her rather than him added another layer of confusion to an already bewildering statement that left audiences unsure whether they had heard correctly or how they were supposed to respond. This type of behavior was part of Morrison's broader strategy of using his stage time not just for musical performance, but also as a platform for psychological experimentation and audience manipulation, where he would test different ways of shocking, challenging, or confronting the people who came to see the Doors perform. Morrison seemed to view his concerts as opportunities to explore the darker corners of human psychology, and to force audiences to confront uncomfortable topics and ideas that they wouldn't normally encounter in entertainment venues. These unpredictable outbursts contributed to Morrison's reputation as a dangerous and potentially unstable performer, which simultaneously attracted fans who were curious about what he might do next, while also making venue owners and concert promoters increasingly reluctant to book the Doors for fear that Morrison's behavior might create legal problems or public relations disasters that could damage their businesses. Fact 15. They recorded soundtrack for Ford training film. Before the Doors became rock legends, they took on one of the most unlikely gigs in music history by providing the soundtrack for a Ford Motor Company employee training film called Love Thy Customer, creating what might be the strangest corporate collaboration ever involving a future psychedelic rock supergroup. This bizarre project happened in early 1966, when the Doors were struggling financially and had just been dropped from a preliminary recording contract with Columbia Records, leaving them desperate for any work that could pay their bills and keep the band together during a particularly difficult period. The opportunity came through Parthenon Pictures, a production company that needed background music for Ford's 25-minute customer service training video, which was designed to teach car dealership employees how to interact more effectively with potential customers. The Doors were hired to provide incidental music that would play underneath the corporate footage, but the process they used to create this soundtrack was completely unconventional and probably unlike anything Ford executives had ever imagined when they commissioned the project. Rather than composing traditional background music in advance, the Doors decided to create the soundtrack through live improvisation, while watching the training film footage in real time. The band crammed themselves into a small screening room at Rampart Studios in Los Angeles, where they watched the corporate video on a tiny monitor while jamming along to whatever was happening on screen. This spontaneous approach meant that their music responded directly to the visual content, creating a soundtrack that was genuinely synchronized with the action, but also completely unpredictable. During this surreal recording session, fragments of what would later become some of the Doors' most famous songs began to emerge, including early versions of I Looked at You, Build Me a Woman, and The Soft Parade. While the band only played instrumental passages for the Ford project, Jim Morrison reportedly contributed percussion and additional sound effects to help create atmosphere for the corporate training scenarios. The entire day of work earned the Doors exactly $200, which was a significant amount of money for the struggling musicians at the time. This corporate soundtrack was believed to be lost for decades until it was discovered in the UCLA film vaults in 2002 and eventually released on a Doors Rarities collection, allowing fans to finally hear what psychedelic rock sounded like when applied to automobile customer service training.